Why ADX Florence in Colorado is worse than death row. In the high desert of southern Colorado sits a prison so controlled, so silent, that even death row inmates across America fear being sent there. Inside these walls, men can spend decades without touching another human being. 23 hours a day, alone. No communal meals. No prison yard conversations. No noise except the echo of steel doors. This is ADX Florence, often called the most secure prison in the United States. But for the men locked inside, many say something unsettling. Death row at least offers an ending. ADX Florence does not. And what happens behind these concrete walls raises a disturbing question. What does it do to a human mind when isolation becomes a permanent way of life? ADX Florence did not appear by accident. It was built out of fear. In the 1980s, violence inside federal prisons reached a boiling point. In 1983, 2 correctional officers were murdered during separate incidents at the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. The event shook the Bureau of Prisons. Administrators concluded that certain prisoners, organized crime bosses, terrorist leaders, violent gang commanders, could still control networks even while incarcerated. Traditional maximum security prisons were no longer enough. The government needed something different, a facility designed not just to contain inmates, but to isolate them from the world entirely. Construction of the Administrative Maximum Facility, or ADX Florence, began in the early 1990s. The design philosophy was simple and chilling. Absolute control. Every architectural detail was engineered to eliminate human contact. Cells were poured from thick, reinforced concrete. Furniture was molded directly into the floor. Doors were controlled electronically from remote stations. Even the windows were positioned so prisoners could see nothing but sky. No horizon, no landscape, no sense of location. The goal was psychological containment. And when ADX Florence officially opened in 1994, it immediately became the most restrictive prison in the United States. But the architecture was only the beginning. What life inside those walls actually looks like is far more disturbing. For prisoners at ADX Florence, life is reduced to a single concrete box. Each cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. Inside, there's a concrete slab for a bed, a thin mattress, a metal sink, a stainless steel toilet bolted to the floor, and a desk, also made from poured concrete. Everything inside the cell is fixed. Nothing moves. Nothing changes. The heavy steel door contains a narrow slot used for food trays and handcuffs. Many inmates refer to it simply as the slot, because that small opening is often the only interaction they will have with another human being all day. Meals arrive through it. Handcuffs are applied through it. And sometimes so is punishment. Above the sink sits a narrow window, but it is not designed to provide a view. The slit is angled so prisoners can only see the sky. No mountains, no desert, no movement of the outside world. Days pass without visual reference. Weeks blend together. Months disappear. And over time, the cell begins to function like something more than a room. It becomes a universe. But the routine inside that universe is even more rigid than the walls themselves.
Life at ADX Florence operates on a schedule so precise it resembles a machine. Lights turn on early in the morning. Breakfast arrives through the slot. No conversation. No eye contact. Sometimes the officer delivering the tray is barely visible. After eating, prisoners return to silence. Some read books. Others write letters. Many simply sit or pace for hours. The next meal arrives at midday. Then dinner later in the afternoon. Each tray is collected the same way it arrived. Through the slot. 3 meals a day. 3 brief reminders that the outside world still exists. Aside from meals, inmates are allowed 1 hour outside their cell. But even that freedom comes with strict limits. They are escorted shackled to what officials call a recreation yard. In reality, it resembles a concrete cage. High walls block any meaningful view. Above them, a metal grate covers the ceiling. From inside, the sky appears as a narrow grid. Many prisoners refer to it as the dog run, because that is exactly how it feels. An hour passes quickly. Then the prisoner is returned to his cell. The door slams shut, and the silence begins again, day after day, year after year. But isolation is only part of what makes ADX Florence so feared. Because inside this prison, power operates differently than in most correctional facilities. And understanding that hidden structure reveals something even darker. In most prisons, guards maintain authority through visible presence. At ADX Florence, control works differently. Much of the prison operates remotely. Officers monitor inmates through cameras and electronic doors. Movement is carefully staged. When a prisoner leaves his cell, other inmates on the same tier are locked down. This prevents any chance of contact. Escorts involve multiple officers, handcuffs, leg irons, sometimes waist chains. Even something as routine as a medical appointment can require a complex security process. This extreme control system was designed for a reason. ADX houses some of the most dangerous inmates in American custody. Among them are convicted terrorists, cartel leaders, and organized crime figures whose influence once stretched across continents. Officials believe that even the smallest communication opportunity could allow these prisoners to maintain power outside prison walls. So the system eliminates opportunities. Letters are screened. Phone calls are rare. Visits occur behind thick glass. No physical contact is allowed. The intention is total separation from society. But critics argue that the system does something else as well. It separates inmates from humanity itself. And the psychological consequences of that separation are still being debated today. What long-term isolation does to the mind is not something science fully understands. But inside ADX Florence, the effects have become impossible to ignore. Humans are social beings. Even the most solitary individuals rely on small forms of contact, conversation, facial expressions, simple acknowledgement. At ADX Florence, those elements largely disappear. Some inmates have described going weeks without speaking a full sentence. Others say they begin to forget what normal conversation feels like. Psychologists who study solitary confinement have documented troubling patterns. Extended isolation can lead to anxiety, depression, hallucinations, memory loss. Some prisoners report hearing voices. Others experience intense paranoia. Even basic time perception can break down. Without regular human interaction or environmental change, the brain begins searching for stimulation. Sometimes it creates its own. Former inmates have described counting steps inside their cells for hours, or tapping on walls in attempts to communicate with neighbors. Some try to exercise constantly. Others stop moving almost entirely, because when days blur together long enough, motivation begins to disappear. And that leads to a question that correctional officials rarely discuss openly. What happens when prisoners lose their ability to function psychologically? The answer leads deeper into the hidden reality of this facility.
Not every inmate at ADX Florence arrives mentally unstable, but long-term isolation can push even psychologically resilient individuals toward crisis. Over the years, lawsuits filed by prisoners and civil rights organizations have argued that the prison's conditions worsen mental illness. Some inmates with diagnosed psychiatric disorders have spent years in solitary units. Court documents have described cases where prisoners harmed themselves, smeared feces on walls, or stopped responding to staff entirely. In response to growing criticism, the Bureau of Prisons has implemented mental health programs and evaluations inside the facility. But critics argue that treatment options remain limited within a system built primarily for control rather than rehabilitation. This tension between security and human psychology sits at the heart of the ADX debate. Officials insist a prison is necessary to contain inmates who pose extraordinary risks. Opponents argue that the conditions resemble a form of psychological punishment, and the debate grows more complicated when examining who exactly ends up here, because not every prisoner inside ADX Florence committed the same kind of crime. Some arrived after violent acts inside other prisons. Others were transferred simply because authorities believed they could still influence criminal networks, which means some men may spend decades in extreme isolation, not for something they did inside ADX, but for what they might do elsewhere. And that uncertainty adds another layer to life inside the facility. one that shapes the survival rules inmates quietly learn. Inside ADX Florence, survival is not about violence. It is about endurance. Prisoners quickly learn that emotional stability becomes a form of currency. Those who maintain routines often cope better. Exercise becomes essential. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing the small cell floor repeatedly. Some inmates schedule their days carefully. Reading in the morning, writing letters in the afternoon, physical exercise in the evening. The routine provides structure where none naturally exists. Other inmates focus on intellectual survival, studying law, learning languages, memorizing books, anything that keeps the mind active. Because the greatest threat inside ADX is not another prisoner. It is psychological collapse. And that collapse can arrive slowly, sometimes after years, which leads to one of the most haunting realities of the prison. Time inside ADX Florence moves differently, much differently. Many inmates at ADX Florence serve long sentences. Some serve life. Others are technically eligible for transfer to less restrictive prisons after demonstrating years of good behavior. But that process moves slowly, very slowly. A prisoner may spend several years in the most restrictive housing unit before even being considered for progression. And advancement requires perfect compliance. No rule violations. No aggressive behavior. No disciplinary reports. If a prisoner succeeds, he may eventually move into a slightly less restrictive unit within the facility. But even then, conditions remain far more isolating than traditional maximum security prisons. For many inmates, the possibility of leaving ADX remains uncertain. And that uncertainty feeds the psychological strain of isolation, because death row inmates, despite facing execution, often have something that ADX prisoners lack: a defined timeline, appeals, court hearings, legal milestones. At ADX Florence, years can pass without any major event, just the same cell, the same silence, the same routine. Which brings us back to the unsettling claim often repeated by inmates themselves, that this place is worse than death row. But to understand why, you have to look at what death row actually offers, and why some prisoners believe it may be the easier path. Death row carries the ultimate punishment, execution. But death row also includes something else: human contact. In many death row units, prisoners interact with staff regularly. Some facilities allow limited communication with other inmates. Legal teams visit. Family members visit. There are court proceedings, appeals, moments that interrupt the routine. ADX Florence strips away most of those interruptions. It replaces them with something far more difficult to measure: endless time in isolation. Many prisoners describe it as a slow psychological erosion rather than a defined punishment. A system where years disappear quietly, and where the outside world gradually feels less real. For some inmates, the idea of execution feels more understandable than permanent isolation, because at least it represents an end. ADX Florence represents something else entirely: indefinite psychological endurance. And that reality continues to fuel debate among legal scholars, psychologists, and prison reform advocates. But one thing remains undeniable: this prison was built to remove the most dangerous individuals from society completely. And in doing so, it created a place unlike almost any other correctional facility on Earth. ADX Florence stands in the Colorado desert as a symbol of ultimate control. A prison designed not simply to punish, but to isolate. Inside its concrete walls, some of the most notorious criminals in modern history live in near total solitude. Days structured by steel doors. Hours measured by silence, years passing beneath a narrow strip of sky. Supporters argue the facility protects society from individuals capable of extreme harm. Critics say the cost is measured in something harder to see: the gradual erosion of the human mind. And perhaps the most unsettling question surrounding ADX Florence is not whether it works, but what it reveals about punishment, about justice, and about how far society is willing to go to control those it fears most. Because in the end, the prison was designed to remove these men from the world completely. Yet the debate about what happens inside those walls refuses to disappear. ADX Florence was not built for ordinary criminals. Every inmate inside arrived because authorities believed traditional prisons could no longer contain them safely. Some had ordered murders from inside prison walls. Others had led organized crime networks that stretched across multiple countries. Still others had committed acts of terrorism that shook governments. Prison officials refer to this population carefully. They are not simply violent offenders. They are high-control inmates. Men who, even while incarcerated, were capable of influencing events outside prison walls. This distinction explains why the Bureau of Prisons treats communication inside ADX so cautiously. Letters are screened carefully. Phone privileges are tightly restricted. Even conversations with lawyers sometimes take place under heavy monitoring conditions depending on the inmate's status. Because the fear inside the system is not simply what these prisoners might do inside the facility. It is what they might still be able to organize outside it. And history has shown that some criminals possess exactly that kind of reach. Cartel leaders who once controlled international drug routes. Terrorist planners responsible for coordinated attacks. Organized crime bosses who once issued orders from behind prison walls. The government solution was simple. If influence depends on communication, remove communication. ADX Florence became the ultimate version of that idea. But the longer the system existed, the more questions began to surface. And those questions started appearing not only in courtrooms, but inside the prison itself, because some inmates began challenging conditions of their confinement, and what they argued raised a fundamental legal issue. At what point does extreme isolation cross the line into something unconstitutional? Over the years, several lawsuits have targeted the conditions inside ADX Florence. Many focused on a central argument, that prolonged solitary confinement can amount to cruel and unusual punishment. The U.S. Constitution's Eighth Amendment prohibits punishments considered inhumane. But defining what counts as inhumane inside modern prisons has never been simple. In one major legal challenge, prisoners argued that mentally ill inmates were being held in conditions that worsened their psychological conditions. Court filings describe individuals who had spent years almost entirely alone. Attorneys claimed the prison lacked adequate mental health treatment for inmates already struggling with severe psychiatric disorders. Government officials responded by emphasizing the facility's purpose. ADX Florence was designed specifically for individuals who pose extreme security threats. According to prison administrators, relaxing restrictions could create serious risks for staff and other inmates. The courts ultimately pushed the Bureau of Prisons to make certain changes. Mental health screening processes improved. Some inmates with severe psychiatric conditions were transferred to facilities with more treatment resources. But the fundamental structure of ADX Florence remained intact. 23 hours a day in a cell, limited human contact, carefully controlled communication. The lawsuits did not dismantle the Supermax model. They only adjusted it. And the debate surrounding solitary confinement continues today. But to truly understand why this prison remains so controversial, it helps to examine something less visible than court rulings. The culture that develops among prisoners who spend years in near total isolation. Because even in a place designed to prevent interaction, human systems still emerge. ADX Florence was designed to eliminate prisoner communication. But human beings have always found ways to connect, even in the harshest conditions. Some inmates learn to tap on walls using coded rhythms. A slow knock, a pause, another pattern. Over time, these signals can form simple messages. Other prisoners communicate by shouting through plumbing systems. Metal pipes running between cells sometimes carry faint sound. A whisper can travel farther than expected. Letters also play a role. Even though mail is screened, inmates can sometimes communicate indirectly through carefully worded messages. And occasionally, prisoners housed in nearby cells develop limited relationships despite never seeing one another. They recognize voices. They learn routines. They exchange brief greetings shouted across corridors during rare moments when doors open simultaneously. These small interactions become lifelines because the human brain craves recognition from others. Even something as small as hearing another person respond can provide psychological relief. Yet those moments remain rare inside ADX Florence. Most prisoners spend the overwhelming majority of their time alone, which brings us to another rarely discussed aspect of life in the Supermax, the staff who work there. Because guarding a prison built around isolation presents its own psychological challenges, and officers assigned to ADX Florence operate inside one of the most controlled environments in the entire federal prison system. Working at ADX Florence requires a different mindset than working in most correctional facilities. Officers rarely interact with inmates in traditional ways. There are no crowded prison yards to supervise, no large dining halls, no busy housing units filled with constant movement. Instead, much of the job revolves around monitoring, watching screens, controlling doors, following carefully choreographed procedures during inmate escorts. The risk level remains high. Even though prisoners are heavily restricted, many of them have histories of extreme violence. Officers must assume that any mistake in procedure could create a dangerous situation. Every movement inside the prison follows strict protocol. 2 or 3 staff members often accompany a single inmate when he leaves a cell. Handcuffs remain secured behind the back. Leg irons prevent sudden running. Radio communication between staff members remains constant. The system depends on precision. Yet officers working long shifts inside such a controlled environment can also experience psychological strain. The silence of the corridors, the knowledge of the crimes committed by some inmates, the constant awareness that the facility houses individuals capable of extraordinary violence. All of these factors shape daily life for staff as well, because ADX Florence does not only isolate prisoners. In some ways, it isolates the people guarding them too. And this unusual environment raises another question rarely asked outside criminal justice circles. Does extreme isolation actually achieve what it was designed to accomplish? Does the Supermax model work? Supporters of ADX Florence argue that the facility solved a major problem. Before its creation, certain inmates continued directing criminal activity even while incarcerated. Some ordered attacks. Others coordinated gang operations. Traditional prisons struggled to stop those communications. ADX Florence changed that dynamic. By limiting nearly all contact with the outside world, the facility dramatically reduced the ability of high-risk inmates to run operations from prison. From a security perspective, many officials consider the prison a success. But critics question whether the psychological cost of such extreme isolation outweighs its benefits. Research into long-term solitary confinement remains ongoing. Some studies suggest that extended isolation can produce lasting mental health effects, even after prisoners are transferred or released. Other experts argue that extremely dangerous inmates require extremely restrictive environments. The debate continues inside academic journals, courtrooms, and correctional policy discussions. But inside the prison itself, the question feels less theoretical, because the men living there experience the system every day. And for some of them, the possibility of leaving ADX Florence remains uncertain, which leads to one final reality that shapes life inside this place: hope, or the absence of it. ADX Florence was built to hold the individuals the system feared most: terrorists, crime bosses, prison leaders who once controlled entire organizations. Its design reflects a belief that some people must be separated from society completely, and in many ways, the facility accomplishes exactly that. Inside its concrete walls, communication nearly disappears. Influence fades. Power dissolves. But the prison also forces a deeper question. What happens when punishment removes not only freedom, but nearly every form of human contact? Supporters say ADX Florence protects the public from individuals capable of extraordinary harm. Critics say the cost is measured in something far less visible: the slow erosion of the human mind. And as long as the prison stands in the quiet desert of Colorado, that debate will continue, because behind those silent concrete walls, men wake up every morning to the same narrow view of the sky. And for many of them, the most difficult part is not knowing when, if ever, that view will change.